Hi everyone, I'm Kazi from New York City, and today we're going to talk about economics. People often think that economics is just about money, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. What economics is about is it affects our entire lives in ways that we can't imagine. It affects the kinds of choices we make, the kinds of lives we lead, and it's such an expansive and big field with so many things to learn about it that we can't even begin to imagine how big the field is. We're going to start off with an introduction to economics and basic concepts so that we can go into detail with econ as we go further along. The first idea of econ that underpins all other concepts is this fundamental idea of scarcity. What is scarcity, you may ask? Scarcity is the idea that there is an amount of limited resources on the earth for us, that we can't have everything we want or need, and there simply isn't enough in the world for everyone. What, when we're talking about wants or needs, are we basically talking about? When we're talking about wants, those it's important in economics to differentiate them and to think of them as different from needs. Wants are things that are pleasant to have but not essential. So, for example, I might want fancy clothes, but not having them would not mean the end of life or would not mean that I would suffer a lot. But needs, on the other hand, are essential for our well-being. If I get sick, I would need medicine. If I need food to survive on a daily basis. So it's important to distinguish between needs and wants. But both are an important concept of scarcity. There are things we want and there are things we need, but we might not essentially get them because the world doesn't have enough resources for us to get everything we want. Otherwise, the world would be a much nicer place, but sadly, that's not the way it is. And when we're talking about wants and needs, we're talking about two different kinds of things. We're talking about goods and we're talking about services. What are goods and services? Goods are basically things we can feel. These are things like items or objects like tables or beds or food. We can feel them, we can touch them. Those things are things the words economists often use is tangible. And things like services are different. We can't often feel them, but it involves doing things for other people, like helping someone fix their phone, things like legal work, cutting their hair, different kinds of things. All of these things make up scarcity, and it's important to understand the different definitions for them. Then we come to this idea of supply and demand, and this is basically a fundamental concept of economics you're just going to keep hearing if you keep studying econ. What is supply? Remember when we were talking about goods and services, like things like tables, beds, services like cutting people's hair, helping someone fix their phone? Well, someone has to be producing them, right? How much of these goods and services are being made is what we call supply. Are we making 100 tables per day? Are we making 1,000 tables per day? How much table? How many tables are being supplied? If we're talking about tables on the same hand, it's not enough to talk about how much of it is being made. It's also important to talk about demand, which is the idea of how much of these goods or services are people willing to buy. Are we making more goods than people are willing to buy? Or we're making 500 tables, but people might just be willing to buy 200 tables. Clearly, there is like a mismatch, and it's important to kind of have supply and demand aligned. But those are things we'll get into a detail a bit later. But supply is the idea of how much is being made, and demand is the idea is how much is being wanted by people. Producers then are the people who are making those goods, who are giving you the supply, who make those goods and sell those goods. And consumers are the people who are demanding those goods. It's people like us who, when we go buy stuff or when we want stuff or stuff like that, we are the ones, in this particular example, we are the ones who are buying the tables, right? So we can be called the consumers, the firms or the businesses, they can be called the producers. Then the question is, if we look at it from the perspective of a producer, this can be a company, this can be Amazon, any company. They need to have these things that we call factors of production, which is anything that's used in making a good or service in economics. And we already know what a good or service is, right? We already know who is making this stuff: producers, companies, firms, different kinds of people. It can also be individuals in shops. But the idea is there are four different kinds of factors of production, or four types of factors of production that we generally think are there in the world and that are used in making a good or service. And obviously, for making something, we think that like all these four things generally exist. The first thing is what we call land and all the natural resources. It's basically we're talking about our Mother Earth, we're talking about everything that the earth has, we're talking about trees, animals, crops. We get the materials from the earth and we make stuff with it. So we're talking about tables, right? How do you make a table? You get wood. How do you get wood? You get wood from trees. That basically means that you need to kind of get that stuff, different kinds of wood, different kinds of tables, but all of that is basically stuff that comes from the land, that comes from the natural resources. And all of that basically is the first kind of fact, it's a one fact, the primary factor of production, which is land and all the natural resources it has. The second thing is the idea of labor. This is all of us, right? We put in effort, we work hard to bring these resources together to make things. Imagine that we just have trees and we have wood, but without people to make those wood or like pieces of wood into tables who work away, carpenters are people who work hard to make sure the tables are made, it would not be possible. And that's what we call labor, the effort that we put into resources to bring these things together to make things. That's what we call labor. So the first thing we learned, land. The second thing we learned, labor. Land is the stuff that we have in nature. Labor is all of us. The third thing is the idea of capital. This sounds like a fancy term, but generally we're just talking about machines and we're talking about tools. We're talking about pens, we're talking about computers, we're talking about machines and factories. But let's say we're talking about making the tables. What did someone who's making a table use? They'd probably use things like a saw, they'd use like a hammer, those kinds of things. And those are the tools and machines they're using to bring together the different resources they got from the earth and try to make it into something. So that's what we call capital, machines and tools that are being used to bring land and labor together. The last thing is what we call entrepreneurship. And that sounds that's like a very simple thing. It's basically the person in charge of everything, the person who's taking the risk to bring everything together, the person who has the courage to start a business, to start a small shop, to start a company. It's basically the human who's bringing everything together, who's taking the risk, who's putting their own money into starting the shop. If they don't take that risk, if they don't bring everything together, then it would not be possible for everything to happen. One question you might have is, what is different from labor? What the difference between labor and entrepreneurship? Think about it like this way. There are a lot of labor that goes into like the work that a company does. But if you're talking about the example of the tables, probably there's a table making company, but there's probably one or a few people who owns the company, who brought everyone together, and there are a bunch of people who work for the company. That's the labor. But the people who made the company, who brought it together, who took the risks of making it, are the ones who we call entrepreneurs. At the end of this slide, it's important, we're just going to do a quick review. There are different kinds of economic elements, but ultimately all of it comes down to scarcity. We can't have everything we want or we need because there isn't enough in the world for everyone. So then important questions come up. How much how much goods and services should be made by producers? How much supply should there be? How much should we want as we demand? Those kinds of things. Producers have to deal with these kinds of questions. What should they make, considering that there are different kinds of things that needs to be made? What should they focus on? Consumers need to think about, considering they can't get everything. What do they want to buy because they have limited amount of resources, limited amount of money? And then there's the question of, how do you make something? What kinds of factors of production do you use? Do you focus on using more natural resources? Do you focus more on using more labor, on more capital? There are so many economic questions that you can think of that I will just leave you with this thought. When it comes to economics, you can start to see how it affects everything around us, starting from the things we use in everyday life and just spilling over to every kinds of consideration. There are no limits to what the kinds of questions we can answer with economics, and that's why it's such a very valuable field. Think about the idea of scarcity, and all of these questions are ultimately designed to address the problem of scarcity, which is a fundamental economic problem. It was great talking about economics and scarcity, and I hope to see you in the next lecture. Thank you.